Julie's funeral was shrouded in gloom. Grief was evident on everyone's faces. Suddenly, the wolf that Julie had saved jumped into the open coffin, curled up on her pure white wedding dress, and refused to leave. A wave of shock and unease spread through the room as its unblinking eyes locked on Julie, almost demanding that they uncover a secret too difficult to imagine. Julia is a person who always has a love for wild nature. Occasionally, she would venture into the dense, untouched forests a few hours outside of town. On one of these trips, Julia found a secluded clearing, pitched a tent, and spent the night. She felt safe, cocooned in nature. As the campfire flickered and her tea cooled in the crisp evening air, she leaned back and gazed at the blanket of stars above. But as the night deepened, a faint sound broke through the symphony of the forest. It was soft at first, a high-pitched whimper that almost blended with the breeze. Julia sat up, her ears straining to catch it again. There it was, a tiny, plaintive cry that tugged at her curiosity and concern. She hesitated. The woods could be dangerous, especially after dark. Yet something about the sound wouldn't let her rest. Against her better judgment, she grabbed a flashlight and cautiously followed the noise, her boots crunching softly on the forest floor. The beam of her flashlight danced through the trees, finally landing on a small, trembling shape huddled near a fallen log. It was a tiny wolf pup, its fur matted and its body visibly shaking. Julia froze, her heart racing. She glanced around, half expecting to see a larger, more menacing shadow, a protective mother wolf ready to pounce. But the forest remained still, eerily quiet, save for the pup's soft cries. Minutes passed, and no other creature appeared. Julia crouched down, keeping her distance, and studied the little animal. Its eyes met hers, wide and desperate, and something in that gaze broke her heart. It was scared, hungry, and alone. The idea of leaving it there was unbearable, but taking it meant a risk she couldn't fully measure. Still, her instincts wouldn't let her walk away. Slowly, she reached out a hand, speaking softly, in a tone meant to calm them both. "Hey, little one, it's okay." The pup didn't resist as she scooped it into her arms. It was lighter than she expected, its fragile frame a testament to how long it had likely been struggling on its own. Julia cradled it close, feeling its tiny heartbeat thrum against her chest. For a moment she stood there in the dark, unsure of what to do next. She wasn't prepared to care for a wild animal, especially one that would grow into a predator. Yet, looking into its trusting eyes, she knew she couldn't abandon it. Back at her camp, she bundled the pup in a spare blanket and fed it bits of bread and water from her supplies. The little creature devoured the food with a quiet desperation that made her wonder just how close it had been to death. She decided then and there to call him Charlie, a name that felt solid and comforting in the face of such vulnerability. Over the next few days, Charlie began to trust her. He followed her movements with cautious curiosity, his tiny tail wagging slightly whenever she approached. Julia found herself talking to him as if he could understand, sharing bits of her life and laughing at the absurdity of her situation. "You're gonna be trouble, aren't you?" she teased one afternoon as he gnawed on the corner of her backpack. But Charlie wasn't just trouble. He was a small living reminder of the bond that could exist between the wild and the human world. Julia knew she couldn't keep him forever. Wolves belonged in the wild, and it was only a matter of time before Charlie would need more than she could provide. Still, she couldn't help but cherish the moments they had, knowing they were temporary. Julia stood at the entrance of the Animal Rescue Center, holding the small wolf pup in her arms. The little creature, barely the size of a small dog, had nestled into her jacket, its tiny frame trembling slightly. She had found it abandoned in the woods the day before, its mother nowhere to be seen. Now, as she looked up at the plain sign reading Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, she felt a mix of relief and hesitation. She had done the right thing, she thought, but something about leaving the pup behind felt unbearably hard. Inside, Nicholas, a staff member at the center, greeted her with a warm smile. "First time here?" he asked, his voice carrying a friendly note. Julia nodded, glancing down at the wolf pup, now awake and peering curiously at the new surroundings. "I found him in the forest. I thought he needed help," she explained, her voice trailing off. Nicholas reached out gently, motioning toward the pup. "May I?" Julia hesitated but nodded, carefully handing over the little wolf. Nicholas examined the animal with practiced hands, his brow furrowing slightly. "He's young, underfed but otherwise in decent health," he said, looking back at her. "We'll take good care of him here." Julia had planned to drop the wolf off and leave quickly, but as she watched Nicholas carry the pup toward a kennel, she found herself rooted in place. The pup let out a faint, plaintive whimper, and Julia's heart sank. Nicholas must have noticed her hesitation because he paused, turning back. "You can stay for a while if you'd like," he said kindly. "I can show you how we care for animals like him." Before she realized it, Julia was nodding. She followed Nicholas down the narrow hallway into a room lined with cages. The air was filled with soft rustling and occasional chirps or growls from various animals. Nicholas gently placed the wolf pup into a clean enclosure, where a soft blanket and a small bowl of water awaited. "He'll need some time to adjust," Nicholas explained, "but we'll make sure he's comfortable." He went on to describe the center's work, rehabilitating injured or orphaned wildlife, and, when possible, releasing them back into the wild. His voice was calm and assured, and Julia found herself feeling more at ease. "I'd like to visit him," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. Nicholas smiled. "Of course. We encourage that. Animals like him do better when they feel connected to someone they trust." The following week, Julia returned to the center. As soon as she approached the pup's enclosure, the little wolf, now officially named Charlie, leapt up and began circling excitedly. His soft yips echoed through the room, and Julia couldn't help but smile. She reached through the bars, offering her hand for Charlie to sniff. The little wolf nuzzled against her fingers, his tail wagging slightly. Julia began visiting Charlie several times a week. Each visit brought new moments of joy. Charlie playfully tugging at a toy she had brought, his sharp little teeth gnawing on a treat she handed him, the way his eyes lit up every time he saw her. She often brought homemade treats for him, pieces of cooked meat or specially made biscuits. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. During one visit, Julia noticed a small scrape on Charlie's paw. She knelt beside his cage, her face lined with concern. Nicholas, who had been nearby, stepped in to help. "Let me show you how to clean that," he offered, fetching a small kit of supplies. Together they worked in silence, Nicholas guiding her hands as she carefully cleaned and bandaged the wound. The quiet moment felt oddly intimate, though neither of them remarked on it. "You're a natural," Nicholas said with a grin when they finished. Julia laughed softly. "I think he just trusts me," she replied, glancing at Charlie, who was already curled up and licking his newly bandaged paw. Over time, Julia and Nicholas began to share more than just work. They exchanged stories about their lives, Julia's love for hiking and solitude in the woods, Nicolet's lifelong passion for wildlife conservation. One afternoon, when Julia forgot to bring Charlie's treats, Nicholas appeared with a small bag of fresh meat. "I had a feeling you might need this," he said, his tone light. Julia couldn't hide her smile. One day, Nicholas invited Julia to assist with a special event at the center, a care day for the center's most vulnerable animals. Together, they fed a young deer that had been rescued after an injury, checked the health of a group of foxes, and cleaned enclosures. Nicholas's calm demeanor and gentle touch with the animals impressed Julia. Watching him, she saw not just a skilled caretaker, but a man whose compassion ran deep. As they worked, their conversations flowed easily. Nicholas shared funny anecdotes about past rescues, and Julia found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. At one point, as they prepared a meal for a pair of orphaned raccoons, Nicholas looked at her thoughtfully. "You've got a gift with animals, you know," he said. Julia shrugged, suddenly shy. "I think it's more about patience than anything else." "Well, patience isn't as common as you might think," Nicholas replied, his tone earnest. Julia glanced up at him, meeting his gaze for a brief moment before looking away. By the end of the day, Julia felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The work had been exhausting but rewarding, and spending time with Nicholas had only added to the experience. As she prepared to leave, Nicholas walked her to the door. "You're always welcome here, you know," he said. Julia smiled, nodding. "I'll be back soon," she promised. As she drove home, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that her visits to the center had become about more than just Charlie. There was something about Nicholas, his kindness, his quiet strength, that stayed with her. But for now, she focused on the joy of seeing Charlie again, already counting down the days until her next visit. Julia and Nicholas's relationship blossomed in the most natural way, built on a foundation of shared moments and mutual respect. They spent their days caring for Charlie, the wolf who had unexpectedly become a bond between them, and for other animals who needed their attention. As weeks turned into months, their connection deepened. One day, Nicholas suggested a weekend getaway to the countryside. Julia hesitated briefly, her mind darting to her condition, but his warm encouragement convinced her. The trip was idyllic, a quiet escape from their everyday routine. They pitched a small tent under the shade of towering oaks, with Charlie wandering nearby, alert but at ease. As the sun set, casting hues of amber and crimson across the sky, they prepared a simple dinner by the fire. The crackling flames accompanied their conversation, which drifted from childhood memories to dreams they hadn't yet shared. Julia spoke of her love for nature, how it was her sanctuary against the struggles of living with epilepsy. Nicholas listened intently, his gaze steady and full of admiration. Her honesty drew him closer. He saw not just a survivor, but a woman of remarkable courage and depth. After the trip, Nicholas couldn't shake the thought of how much Julia meant to him. He decided it was time to take the next step. Days later, he led her on a surprise walk through the woods, carefully guiding her to a small stream hidden deep within the trees. The very place where Charlie had first been rescued. The spot held a quiet magic, its gentle waters reflecting the sunlight in soft ripples. Nicholas handed her a bouquet of red roses, his hands trembling slightly. "Julia," he began, his voice low but steady, "I've never felt this way before. You make everything feel possible. Would you be willing to share the rest of your life with me?" Her eyes welled with tears as she nodded, the smile on her face radiant and heartfelt. "Yes, Nicholas, yes." They embraced, their surroundings falling silent except for the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Charlie stood nearby, watching, a silent witness to a promise made under the open sky. In the year that followed, their relationship thrived. They built a life filled with simple joys, from quiet evenings reading together to adventurous hikes in the woods. The decision to marry felt as natural as their love itself. Neither wanted an extravagant event. They envisioned an intimate ceremony surrounded by loved ones and the nature they both cherished. Julia spent hours selecting her wedding dress. She wasn't looking for extravagance, but something that reflected her essence, graceful, uncomplicated, and true. Meanwhile, Nicola and his friends worked tirelessly to prepare a small garden venue. It was a place where the stars would be visible, where the beauty of the evening would match their quiet, enduring love. But life, often unpredictable, took a cruel turn. On a crisp morning just weeks before their wedding, Nicholas arrived at Julia's home with plans to finalize the last details. He knocked lightly on the door, but there was no response. Concerned, he let himself in, calling her name as he climbed the stairs. He found her lying on the bed, still and unresponsive. At first, he thought she was asleep, her face calm and serene as always. But when his soft calls and gentle shakes yielded no response, a chill ran down his spine. "Julia," he whispered, a tremor in his voice. "Wake up." Panic began to set in. He checked for signs of breathing, his fingers trembling as they brushed her wrist in search of a pulse. Unable to think clearly, he fumbled for his phone and dialed emergency services. The minutes stretched endlessly as he waited, pacing the small room that held so many memories of their shared joy. When the paramedics arrived, Nicholas stepped aside, his heart pounding as they examined Julia. Their grim expressions confirmed his worst fears. One of them turned to him and spoke softly. "I'm so sorry. She's gone." It was likely a seizure in her sleep. Nicholas staggered backward, unable to comprehend the words. Gone? How could she be gone? Just days ago, they had laughed while choosing music for the ceremony. They had imagined their future, a life together filled with love and hope. And now, she was gone. The paramedics moved carefully, but Nicholas barely noticed. He sat by the bed, his hand clutching hers, as if willing her to return. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of his uneven breathing. The wedding dress she had so lovingly chosen hung on the door, its soft fabric swaying gently, as if mocking the stillness of her lifeless form. As hours passed, the reality began to sink in, though it felt no less surreal. The room, once filled with warmth and life, now seemed unbearably cold. Charlie, who had been waiting downstairs, padded quietly into the room. The wolf nudged Nicholas's side, his golden eyes reflecting the same loss that Nicholas felt. "I don't know what to do, Charlie," Nicholas whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to go on without her." The wolf let out a low, mournful whine, lying at Nicholas's feet, offering what comfort he could. In that moment, man and beast shared a grief so profound that words became unnecessary. The funeral of Julia was as somber as one could imagine. Her loved ones gathered in the small chapel, their faces etched with grief as the soft hum of prayers filled the room. Julia lay in her coffin, dressed in the wedding gown she had once admired with sparkling eyes. The air hung heavy with sorrow, each person lost in their memories of her gentle smile and kind heart. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. A rustling sound at the door drew all eyes, and before anyone could react, Charlie, the wolf Julia had once saved, bolted into the room. The wolf's silver-grey coat glinted in the dim light as he made his way directly to the coffin. The room went still, breaths held in shock as Charlie leaped into the open casket. He curled his body close to Julia, his head resting on her chest, as if trying to protect her. It wasn't just a moment of stillness, it was as if Charlie was trying to tell them something. His piercing amber eyes stared at Julia's pale face, unmoving, as though he could sense something no one else could. A low, mournful whine escaped his throat, echoing off the walls and wrapping everyone in an eerie unease. Nicholas, Julia's fiancé, was the first to move. "Charlie, no, you can't," he murmured, stepping forward. His voice broke slightly, and he clenched his fists to steady himself. Others in the room began murmuring, unsure of how to handle this strange and uninvited guest. A few men, Nicholas included, cautiously approached the coffin. They tried to coax the wolf away with soft words and gentle hands, but Charlie was resolute. He clung to Julia's side, letting out a deep growl when Nicholas attempted to pull him away. It wasn't aggression, though. It was anguish, the kind that seeped into the room and made even the most skeptical observer pause. As Nicholas tried once again to pull Charlie from the coffin, Julia's father, Mr. Thompson, stepped forward, his face clouded with frustration. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is a funeral, not a spectacle. Get that animal out of here." "Mr. Thompson, please," Nicholas said, his tone a mixture of pleading and resolve. "I think Charlie is trying to tell us something. He wouldn't act like this without a reason." Julia's mother, her face pale and tear-streaked, gripped her husband's arm. "James, maybe he's right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You remember how much Julia loved Charlie. She always said he understood her in ways we couldn't." "Elizabeth," Mr. Thompson shot back, his frustration boiling over. "She's gone. No animal's going to change that. We need to let her rest." He turned to Nicholas, his tone hardening. "This ends now." But Nicholas stood his ground. "Mr. Thompson, I understand how you feel. I do. But please, just look at him." He gestured to Charlie, who was now letting out a series of low, mournful sounds, his body trembling as he pressed closer to Julia. "He's not just grieving. He's trying to tell us something. Julia saved him once. Let him do the same for her." The room was silent, tension hanging thick in the air. Julia's mother spoke again, this time louder, her voice breaking. "James, let them try. If there's even the smallest chance." She trailed off, clutching her husband's arm tighter. Mr. Thompson exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his grief. "Fine," he said, his voice low and strained. "But this is on you, Nicholas. Don't you dare give us false hope." Nicholas nodded, his chest tightening with a mixture of determination and fear. Without wasting another moment, he pulled out his phone and called for the rescue team. When the medics arrived, the lead doctor initially balked at the request. "We conducted every necessary test," he explained, his tone professional but impatient. "There's no mistake. She's gone." "Please," Nicholas urged, his voice steady but desperate. "I'm asking for just one more check. Look at him." He pointed to Charlie, whose unwavering presence seemed almost supernatural. "I know it sounds crazy, but he knows something. Julia would have done the same for him." The doctor sighed, exchanging uncertain glances with his colleagues. Julia's parents stood silently nearby, their faces a mix of skepticism and reluctant hope. Finally, the doctor relented. "All right, but I'm telling you, this isn't going to change anything." The room was thick with tension as the doctors hovered over Julia's still form. They worked meticulously, their movements deliberate and silent, except for the occasional whispered instruction. This time, they used advanced equipment brought in from the ambulance, tools that hadn't been utilized during the initial examination. One doctor, an older man with graying hair and a furrowed brow, paused mid-check. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the stethoscope on Julia's chest. "Hold on," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. He motioned for a nurse to bring over a more sensitive monitor. The team gathered closer, their faces tight with concentration. The data coming through began to paint an unexpected picture. There it was, a faint, almost imperceptible signal. Julia's breathing wasn't completely absent. It was shallow, so delicate it had been overlooked before. Her heartbeats were slow, spaced apart like distant echoes. But they were there. The realization hit the doctor, and his voice broke the heavy silence. "She's not dead." The words seemed to freeze the room. Nicholas, who had been standing in the corner, pale and motionless, stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean?" "She's alive." One of the doctors, a younger man with a steady but bewildered expression, explained, "It's likely catalepsy, a rare condition where the body mimics death." It's extremely difficult to detect without specialized equipment. Combined with her epilepsy, this could explain why the initial assessment was wrong. Nicholas's knees nearly gave way, but he held onto the edge of the table for support. "Are you saying—" His voice cracked and he had to swallow hard before continuing. "Are you saying she's been alive this whole time?" The older doctor nodded, his expression somber. "We can't waste another second. We need to get her to the hospital." As the room exploded into controlled chaos, Julia's parents arrived, their faces etched with worry. Her mother rushed to Nicholas, her voice trembling. "What's going on? Is our daughter—" Nicholas turned to her, his face still pale, but now holding a glimmer of hope. "She's alive. They think it's catalepsy." Her husband, James, placed a steadying arm around her shoulders, though his own eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We're going with her," he said firmly. Julia was carefully transferred onto a stretcher, her fragile form swaddled in layers of medical equipment. Nicholas followed closely, his heart pounding in a chaotic rhythm of hope and fear. Her parents stayed close by, their hands tightly clasped together, as if the connection between them could somehow keep their daughter tethered to life. Charlie, the wolf who had refused to leave her side, trotted behind, his piercing eyes fixed on Julia. When they arrived at the hospital, the scene was just as frantic. Nurses and technicians rushed to prepare the room, and the doctors briefed the hospital team on Julia's condition. Nicholas stood at the doorway, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, while Julia's parents huddled together nearby, their faces filled with a mix of fear and hope. Charlie sat next to Nicholas, his large frame exuding a quiet but intense presence. Inside the room, the doctors worked tirelessly, their focus unwavering. Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity as they monitored Julia's fragile signs of life, adjusting medications and oxygen levels with meticulous care. The team knew the odds were slim. Catalepsy could leave the body dangerously deprived of oxygen, and even if Julia survived, the risk of brain damage loomed large. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the hospital windows, one of the monitors emitted a steady beep that hadn't been there before. It was faint, but unmistakable. Julia's heartbeat was strengthening. A nurse turned to the lead doctor, her face breaking into a relieved smile. "She's stabilizing," the doctor confirmed, his voice laced with cautious optimism. Nicholas, who had been pacing outside the room, froze in his tracks. He spun around to face the nurse who stepped out to deliver the news. "She's going to be okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "She's out of immediate danger," the nurse replied gently. "She's still very weak, but we've managed to bring her back." Overwhelmed, the three of them entered the room together. Julia lay motionless on the bed, her chest rising and falling in a slow but steady rhythm. Her face, though pale and drawn, was unmistakably alive. As they approached her bedside, her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, she opened her eyes, her expression dazed and unfocused. Her mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Julia, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Julia's lips moved slightly, though no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, she murmured, "Mom? Dad?" Tears streamed down her face as she leaned over to touch her daughter's hand. "We're here, honey. We're all here." Nicholas stepped closer, his voice soft. "Julia, you're okay." Charlie, who had been watching quietly from the corner, stood and moved closer. He rested his head gently on the edge of Julia's bed, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her expression softening as recognition dawned. "You!" she whispered, her voice cracking. "You saved me!" Nicholas reached out to stroke Charlie's head. "We all owe him everything," he said, his voice choked with gratitude. As the room fell into a stillness that felt more like peace than tension, Julia's hand moved weakly toward Charlie. The wolf leaned in, his warm fur brushing against her trembling fingers. For the first time since the ordeal began, they allowed themselves to believe that their daughter was truly going to be okay. Julia lay quietly in her hospital bed, the soft hum of the machines around her a constant reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. Nicholas sat by her side, his hand gently clasping hers as he began to speak. His voice was steady, but tinged with emotion, and Julia could see the weight of recent events etched into his face. "It all started that morning," Nicholas began. "When I found you." He paused, his throat tightening at the memory. "I thought you were gone, Julia. The doctors confirmed it. I don't think I've ever felt a pain so deep." His voice cracked slightly, but he continued. "We dressed you in the wedding gown just like you had dreamed, and we planned the funeral. It felt like the only way to honor what we had lost." Julia listened, her fingers tightening slightly around Nicholas's hand. She wanted to comfort him, but she needed to hear everything. And then, at the service, Nicholas's voice softened, his eyes flicking briefly toward Charlie, who lay at the foot of the bed, his golden eyes never leaving Julia. "Charlie wouldn't leave you. He ran straight to your coffin and just stayed there, like he knew something none of us did. No one could move him, Julia. Not me, not anyone." Julia's brow furrowed. She glanced at Charlie, her expression a mix of amazement and disbelief. He knew," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Nicholas nodded. "I didn't understand it either, but there was something in his behavior, something so determined, so unlike anything I'd ever seen. It made me call the doctors back, even though they were sure. And then..." He took a breath, the memory still vivid. "They found it. They realized you weren't gone after all, that you had catalepsy." Julia's breath caught, her gaze fixed on Nicholas. The room felt still, as if time itself had paused to allow her to process his words. "Charlie. He saved me," she said softly, her voice trembling. Nicholas reached out, his other hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Yes, he did. If it weren't for him, Julia, we might never have known. He gave us a second chance." Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. She reached out to Charlie, her hand brushing against his thick fur. The wolf lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers with a calm, knowing look. "You've always been special, haven't you, Charlie?" she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the steady rhythm of the machines. Julia's mind wandered to the day she first found Charlie, a small, helpless cub abandoned in the wilderness. She had thought she was saving him, but now it seemed that he had been destined to save her in return. In the days that followed, Julia's recovery was steady. Each moment felt like a gift, and her gratitude only deepened with every passing hour. Nicholas was always nearby, a steady presence, his love for her evident in every small gesture. And Charlie, as always, was at her side, a silent but constant reminder of the bond they shared. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Nicholas entered the room carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. He placed them on the bedside table and sat down beside Julia, his eyes bright with determination. "I've been thinking," he said, "we need to have that wedding, for real this time." Julia smiled, her eyes lighting up. "You mean it?" "Of course I do," he said. "We've been given a second chance, Julia. I don't want to waste a single moment of it. And I think Charlie deserves to be there too. He's part of our story now." Julia laughed softly, the sound full of warmth. "He wouldn't let us leave him out even if we tried." Julia and Nicholas sat together at the kitchen table, the soft glow of a lamp casting a warm light over the pages of a wedding planner. After everything they had endured, the act of planning their wedding again felt like a gift they no longer took for granted. Nicholas smiled at Julia as she flipped through color samples for the flowers, her expression thoughtful. He reached out, placing his hand over hers. "Lilacs," he said softly. "They were your mother's favorite, weren't they?" Julia nodded, her eyes glistening with a quiet gratitude. The days that followed were filled with decisions, some small, others more significant, but all infused with care. They debated over menu options, Julia insisting on a vegetarian dish for her friends from the animal shelter, while Nicholas argued for a hearty roast that would please his uncle. The guest list was adjusted, trimming some names while adding others who had been important to their journey. Even the venue, a simple clearing in the woods surrounded by towering oaks, felt like the perfect representation of their shared love for nature. Charlie, their ever-watchful companion, became an integral part of this process. Whether they were at the shelter discussing seating arrangements or out in the woods, scouting for the best spot to set up the altar, the loyal wolf was always nearby. Julia often found herself sitting beside him, her fingers buried in his thick fur as she whispered her thoughts. "What do you think, Charlie? Too many candles, or just right?" she'd muse, earning a quiet huff from the wolf as though he understood. Nicholas would laugh from a few steps away. "You know, Jules, he's probably more invested in the catering than the decor." Family and friends rallied around the couple, their support a reminder of how much Julia and Nicholas's love had inspired those around them. On one weekend, Julia's sister arrived with boxes of decorations she'd handmade, including tiny wolf-shaped place cards for the tables. "It's only fitting," she joked, "since Charlie's the real hero here." The women laughed, though Julia's smile lingered, her thoughts momentarily drifting to how close she had come to missing this day. Nicholas's parents took charge of the logistics, ensuring the caterers, florists, and musicians would all arrive on time. Friends from the shelter offered to help set up the venue, and even the local townspeople who had heard their story volunteered in small but meaningful ways. Each person seemed to carry a shared sense of awe at what this wedding represented. Not just the union of two people, but a testament to survival, resilience, and love. In the midst of all the busyness, Julia took a quiet moment to revisit her wedding dress. Hanging carefully in her closet, the gown gleamed softly, untouched since the day Nicholas had laid it over her lifeless body, believing it would be the last time she wore it. Now, as she smoothed her hand over the delicate lace, she felt its weight differently. This dress was no longer just a symbol of romance. It carried with it a story of triumph and the promise of second chances. "Still fits like a glove," Nicola teased as Julia tried it on, spinning slowly before the mirror. She laughed, but her eyes found his in the reflection, and for a moment the world around them seemed to pause. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped closer, pulling her into his arms. "You don't have to thank me for anything. We made it here together." Charlie, lying by the bedroom door, let out a small, satisfied growl, as though he too approved of how far they'd come. Julia knelt beside him, pressing her forehead gently to his. "And you," she murmured. "I wouldn't be here without you." The wolf's amber eyes met hers, a quiet understanding passing between them. As the days drew closer to the wedding, word of their story spread throughout the town. People spoke of Julia's miraculous recovery, of the wolf who had refused to leave her side, and of the love that had been tested in ways few could imagine. Strangers sent letters of congratulations, and a few even left small gifts at the animal shelter with notes addressed to the wolf's family. Nicholas found it amusing, but Julia saw it as a testament to how deeply their journey had touched others. The morning before the wedding, the clearing in the woods began to transform. Wooden benches were arranged in rows. An arch woven with wildflowers stood proudly at the center, and lanterns hung from the trees, ready to light up the evening. Julia walked through the space with Charlie by her side, imagining how it would look tomorrow when she and Nicholas would finally exchange their vows. "Ready for this?" Nicholas asked as he joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Julia leaned into him, her gaze fixed on the altar. "I've never been more ready for anything," she replied softly. Charlie let out a low, approving howl, his tail wagging slightly as if to say he was ready too. That night, as they sat around a small fire with their closest friends and family, Julia couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the love that surrounded them. Charlie lay stretched out near her feet, his head resting on his paws. Nicholas took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a silent gesture of reassurance. "Tomorrow's the big day," Julia's sister said, raising a glass. "To Julia, Nicholas, and of course, Charlie. May your love story continue to inspire us all." The small group echoed the toast, their voices carrying warmth and joy. Julia looked at Nicholas, then down at Charlie. Tomorrow, she thought, would not just mark the start of their married life, but the celebration of every moment that had brought them here. And with Charlie by their side, she knew it would be perfect. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the quaint little church nestled on the edge of the forest. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and the sound of birds singing created a serene backdrop. Inside, the pews were filled with family and friends, their faces glowing with anticipation. Everyone knew this was no ordinary wedding, and the story behind it had touched their hearts in ways they could never forget. The soft notes of a piano began to play, signaling the start of the ceremony. All eyes turned to the entrance as the heavy wooden doors slowly opened. Julia stood there, radiant in her white gown, the very same dress she had chosen months ago when life felt simpler. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her bouquet, but her smile was steady. Nicholas, waiting at the altar, couldn't take his eyes off her. He seemed rooted in place, as if the moment were too overwhelming to fully process. Walking beside Julia was Charlie, the wolf who had become more than just an animal to everyone present. With his sleek fur and piercing amber eyes, he walked with a grace that matched Julia's, a loyal companion to the woman who had once saved him and whom he, in turn, had saved. As Julia reached the altar, she handed her bouquet to her sister and turned to Nicholas. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, letting the weight of their shared journey settle between them. The pastor cleared his throat softly, breaking the spell, and began to speak. His voice carried the familiar cadence of sincerity, recounting the vows they were about to exchange. Julia and Nicholas repeated the words, their voices steady, but filled with emotion. "I promise to stand by your side, in joy and sorrow, in sickness and health," Julia said, her voice catching slightly as she spoke. A tear escaped down her cheek, and Nicholas gently reached up to wipe it away. "I promise to protect your heart, to cherish you, and to be your family." When it was Nicholas's turn, his voice was warm and strong. "I vow to love you as fiercely as you deserve, to honor the strength you've shown, and to treasure every moment we have together." The sincerity in his voice made even the most stoic guest dab at their eyes. As the vows were sealed with a kiss, a soft cheer rippled through the congregation, followed by clapping. Charlie, sitting at the edge of the altar, raised his head slightly, his ears twitching as if he too were acknowledging the moment. Around his neck was a simple leather collar handcrafted by Nicholas himself. It bore a small silver tag engraved with the words, "Forever Loyal." The gesture was small, but deeply meaningful, a reminder of how vital Charlie had been to the story that had unfolded. After the ceremony, the newlyweds led the procession out of the church, with Charlie proudly walking alongside them. Guests emerged into the sunlight, where tables had been set up for the reception, beneath the canopy of tall oak trees. The air was filled with laughter and the soft hum of conversations as people mingled, sharing memories of the day and marveling at the presence of Charlie, who seemed to carry himself with a sense of purpose and quiet dignity. As they took their seats for dinner, Nicholas rose to give a toast. "To Julia," he began, his voice steady but filled with warmth, "the woman who has taught me the meaning of resilience, love, and hope. And to Charlie, who showed us that loyalty and bravery can come from the most unexpected places. Without him, none of us would be here celebrating this beautiful day." Julia raised her glass, her smile soft as she glanced at Charlie. "To all of us," she added, "to life, love, and the miracles we don't always see coming." The rest of the evening was a blur of joy and celebration. Julia and Nicholas shared their first dance as husband and wife, twirling slowly under the soft glow of string lights. Charlie lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, watching them with a quiet contentment. Children ran around the tables, their laughter ringing through the air, and even the adults let themselves be carried away by the happiness of the moment. As the sun began to set, casting the forest in hues of orange and pink, Julia and Nicholas took a quiet moment to themselves. They stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out at the horizon. Charlie stood beside them, his presence steady and reassuring. Julia reached down to scratch behind his ears. "You've always been my guardian," she said softly. "Thank you for everything, Charlie." Nicholas slipped his arm around her waist. "We owe him more than we could ever put into words," he agreed. They stood there in silence for a while, letting the weight of the day settle in their hearts. As they returned to the reception, the glow of the lanterns illuminated the scene of pure joy. Julia, Nicholas, and Charlie walked together, a united family bound not just by love, but by the extraordinary journey they had shared. For everyone who had been part of their story, it was a day that would be remembered as a testament to resilience, the power of connection, and the miracles that could come from the unlikeliest places. As the evening fades into a peaceful night, Julia, Nicholas, and Charlie stand together as a family, a true testament to the power of love, loyalty, and second chances. Their journey from heartache to hope is a story that reminds us all to cherish the bonds we hold dear and to never underestimate the miracles that life can bring. What did you think about Julia and Nicholas's extraordinary story? If this story moved you or reminded you of someone special, don't forget to like, share, and spread the word. Maybe their story will inspire someone else to believe in the power of connection and the magic of life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.